And I now give the floor to the distinguished permanent representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. You have the floor, sir.
شكرا سيدي الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before I start my statement, allow me to inform you of the latest developments in the city of Aleppo. Based on Syrian-Russian coordination, a unilateral cessation of hostilities has been declared in eastern Aleppo for humanitarian purposes to allow the evacuation of the wounded, the sick, and the elderly from eastern Aleppo. We have facilitated the arrival of a team of UN entities operating in Damascus under the leadership of the Resident Coordinator of the United Nations, along with the ICRC and the SARC, to supervise the evacuation process. The Syrian government has allocated 6 corridors for civilians and 2 corridors for armed individuals. We have called on these armed individuals to regularize their situation through an amnesty or to leave the city. However, terrorist groups have used people in eastern Aleppo as human shields, notably Al-Nusra Front and Ahrar al-Sham, both Al-Qaeda affiliated groups. These terrorist groups have prevented civilians and armed individuals from leaving the city through the use of sniper fire and rockets, which continue unabated, targeting the people of Aleppo and the corridors. These same groups executed today 14 people in Aleppo because they called other people to leave the terrorist-held neighborhoods. These terrorist groups have threatened the people to burn their homes and to kill them if they decide to leave the city. They told the people, and I quote, "We have come to establish the Islamic State, and you want to leave us alone to confront the Syrian army," end quote. Mr. President, I would like to thank you for convening this important meeting. The Syrian government welcomes the convening of any meeting on Syria as long as it aims to help the Syrian people in an honest manner, instead of exploiting its suffering for political interventionist agendas, especially by states that violate the sovereignty of Syria through a so-called international coalition against terrorism. The government of the Syrian Arab Republic does not deny that there is a humanitarian crisis in my country and that there are displaced people, refugees, and affected people, millions of them. However, we denounce the erroneous approach to this crisis since its onset. We are surprised of the piecemeal approach adopted without taking into consideration the background of the crisis, including the terrorist, political, military, and economic interference in Syrian affairs. Allow me, Mr. President, to walk you through what has happened in the city of Aleppo so far. The city of Aleppo remained a peaceful and stable city during the 1.5 years after the onset of the crisis in my country, Syria. The situation soon deteriorated in August 2012, when the Turkish regime decided to open its borders to herds of mercenary terrorists funded by Saudi Arabia and Qatar and trained by the United States on Turkish territories. These terrorists overran the peaceful city of Aleppo and used civilians as human shields. They destroyed the heritage and the history of the city that dates back to tens of thousands of years. They looted its factories and they sold all their machines inside Turkey. The city of Aleppo, or the eastern part of Aleppo, was home to 2 million civilians. 1,700,000 of those have taken refuge in government-held areas since August 2012, fleeing the terror of these so-called moderate groups. The terrorist groups that control the eastern part of the city, some countries choose to call them moderate armed opposition or non-state armed groups or screened opposition groups. This is a new term, or even angels. These countries provide all sorts of support to these groups. These groups include 27 terrorist factions, and Al-Nusra Front is the main faction of these. The remaining groups are either affiliated with Al-Qaeda or ISIS or Al-Nusra Front. What is more, Mr. President, is that all these groups rejected the Russian-American agreement of September 9, 2016. They have also rejected the initiative by Mr. de Mistura. They rejected the Syrian-Russian initiative that was announced recently by the Syrian government on October 10th. This initiative would guarantee the safety of those armed individuals who choose to leave the area, so that they would regularize their situation or head to other areas with their individual weapons. The initiative also calls for the evacuation of the wounded and the sick while providing them with medical assistance in order to normalize the situation in eastern Aleppo and to allow state institutions to resume their work by providing basic services to all individuals and citizens who choose to remain in eastern Aleppo. The Syrian government continues to cooperate with the United Nations to ensure the delivery of humanitarian assistance to all citizens affected by the crisis, wherever they may be and without any distinction, according to the United Nations guidelines for emergency humanitarian assistance, in line with General Assembly Resolution 46/182. In this regard, this week, we have provided humanitarian assistance to unstable areas, and these are Western Harasta, Qudsiyya, Douma, and Tal. We are currently seeking to implement the October response plan in cooperation with the United Nations. I have a few questions I would like to address to the Secretariat. One, how can the humanitarian situation in my country, Syria, improve while unilateral coercive measures continue to be imposed on the Syrian people, these so-called sanctions? How can we improve the situation while mercenary foreign terrorists continue to flood our country or through the borders with Turkey? These terrorists provided with support from those countries, the same countries who called for the convening of this meeting. Why there has been no progress in implementing Security Council resolutions 2170, 2178, 2199, and 2253, all these resolutions on counterterrorism. Can the Secretariat explain why people in Qudsiyya today welcomed the Syrian army and state institutions in areas in which reconciliation agreements have been implemented after fighters and armed individuals decided to leave? Doesn't this mean that these people reject the control of armed individuals on their neighborhoods, allowing terrorist groups to stay in their positions amidst the civilians and to establish self-government areas means that we would be colluding with terrorism and means that the state, any state, would be absolving its responsibility towards its citizens. These are my comments, Mr. President, related to the humanitarian situation. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished permanent representative of the Syrian Arab Republic